Somewhere in the last 50,000 years, something shifted. Not a volcano, not a meteor, not a war, nothing loud. Nothing that would have made the ground shake or the sky turn dark. Just a quiet, almost imperceptible change in the way certain humans were thinking, connecting, creating. And somehow, from that shift, everything else followed. The world you're lying in right now, the ceiling above you, the device in your hand, the language moving through your mind as you listen to these words, all of it traces back to a turning point so gradual that the people living through it almost certainly had no idea it was happening. That's what makes this one of the strangest mysteries in all of human history. It didn't announce itself. If you pulled back far enough, looked at the archaeological record from a distance, you'd see something remarkable. Around 50,000 years ago, give or take quite a bit, the evidence for symbolic thinking starts appearing with more frequency. Shell beads strung into necklaces, ochre ground into pigment and pressed against cave walls, blades crafted with a precision that goes beyond pure function. Humans pushing into new landscapes, crossing open water, reaching places their ancestors never attempted. And then almost simultaneously in geological terms, the other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, begin to disappear. Modern humans are suddenly everywhere, and nobody fully agrees on why. That's what tonight is about. Not a tidy explanation. Not a single eureka moment that unlocks everything. This is going to be a slow, evidence-led walk through the clues, the competing theories, the things scientists agree on and the things they absolutely don't. Because the honest answer to what changed 50,000 years ago is that we're still figuring it out. And that uncertainty, far from being frustrating, is actually one of the most interesting things about this story. Every answer opens 3 more questions. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now? And what time is it? Because I genuinely love knowing. Someone is listening to this at 2 a.m. in Melbourne with rain on the window. Someone else is in a car outside Stockholm with the heat on full. Someone is in Lagos or Sao Paulo or a small town in Montana where the night is very quiet and very dark. Drop it in the comments if you feel like it. Not because I need to know, but because there's something quietly extraordinary about the fact that right now, all of these different places and all of these different nights are sharing the same wondering about the same ancient question. Humans connecting across distance through language and story, which, as it turns out, might be exactly what this episode is about. Now, here's the thing about the 50,000-year mark. It's not a clean line. Dates in archaeology are always messier than they sound in headlines. Some of the behaviours we associate with this supposed leap appear much earlier in Africa. Pigment use going back 100,000 years or more. Shell beads that predate the supposed turning point by tens of thousands of years. Engraved geometric patterns that no one can quite explain. So the question isn't simply when did symbolic culture begin? It's more subtle than that. Why does it seem to accelerate? Why does it appear in more places, with more complexity, with more apparent staying power in the period after roughly 50,000 years ago? What changed not just in what humans were doing, but in how consistently and how ambitiously they were doing it? Some researchers think it was a biological change, something in brain wiring or language capacity that crossed a threshold. Others think it was purely cultural, a kind of critical mass of learned behaviour and social complexity that started feeding back on itself. Still others point to climate, to population pressure, to the accidents of preservation that make some eras look richer in the record, simply because more survived. There are strong arguments for each, and even stronger arguments about how to weigh them against each other. We're going to move through all of it. The cave art and the bone needles, the coastlines and the cold steppes, the genetics and the social networks, and the quiet revolution of memory and tradition. Each piece adds something. None of them alone is the answer. But it starts with the ground, with stone and bone and pigment pressed into rock by hands that have been gone for tens of thousands of years. Hands that, for reasons we're still trying to understand, began leaving more behind. Let's look at what they left. So when archaeologists and anthropologists say 50,000 years ago, what do they actually mean? Because that number gets thrown around with a confidence that the evidence doesn't always fully support. It's worth slowing down here before we dive into the specifics of what changed, and being honest about what we're actually working with. Because the messiness of the timeline isn't a footnote. It's part of the story. Start with the tools scientists use to date ancient material. The most famous is radiocarbon dating, and most people have a rough sense of how it works. Living organisms absorb carbon from the atmosphere, including a radioactive form called carbon-14. When they die, the carbon-14 starts decaying at a predictable rate. Measure how much is left, and you can estimate when the organism died. Elegant in principle. But here's the catch. Radiocarbon dating becomes significantly less reliable beyond about 40,000 to 45,000 years. The signal gets weaker. The margin of error grows. A date from that range might come back as 48,000 years ago, plus or minus 3,000 years. Which sounds precise until you realize that 3,000 years is longer than all of recorded history. And that's before you account for contamination, which is a persistent problem with ancient organic samples. A tiny amount of modern carbon introduced during excavation, storage, or processing can make something appear much younger than it really is. So when you see a date like 52,000 years ago attached to a piece of carved bone, there's always a range of uncertainty wrapped around it that doesn't always make it into the headline. There's also the problem of calibration. Radiocarbon dates aren't calendar dates. They have to be converted using calibration curves built from tree rings, ice cores, and coral records, all of which help researchers account for the fact that atmospheric carbon levels haven't been constant over time. And those calibration curves get revised as new data comes in, which means a date published in 2005 might shift by several thousand years when recalculated with a 2020 calibration curve. This is normal science. This is how knowledge improves. But it also means that chronologies are genuinely in motion, and anyone presenting the timeline as fixed is simplifying. For material older than radiocarbon's reliable range, scientists turn to other methods. Optically stimulated luminescence, which dates the last time sediment grains were exposed to light. Uranium series dating, which works on cave formations and bones. Electron spin resonance. Each method has its own strengths, its own blind spots, its own error ranges. And they don't always agree with each other. When multiple methods converge on a similar date, researchers feel more confident. When they diverge, the debate begins. You're seeing the machinery of science working in real time, which is occasionally frustrating but mostly fascinating. Beyond the dating tools themselves, there's another layer of difficulty, which is stratigraphy. When something is buried matters enormously. An artifact found in a particular layer of sediment is assumed to date to the period that layer was deposited, but layers shift. They get disturbed by animal burrows, tree roots, human activity, water movement. Objects can migrate upward or downward through sediment over time, a process called bioturbation, and end up in a layer that doesn't reflect when they were actually used or left. This is why archaeologists are so painstaking about context. A bead found on the surface tells you almost nothing. A bead found in an undisturbed layer, surrounded by other material that can be independently dated, tells you much more. But truly undisturbed archaeological sites are rarer than you'd hope, especially for material that's tens of thousands of years old. All of this is before we even get to the question of what the dates are measuring. A date tells you when something was deposited or died. It doesn't always tell you when something was made or used or first invented. The oldest known example of a behavior isn't the same as the origin of that behavior. It's just the oldest example that survived, that was excavated, that was recognized for what it was. Those are three separate filters, each one throwing away evidence. Which brings us to preservation bias, and this one genuinely changes how you read the entire record. Different materials survive at wildly different rates. Stone is nearly indestructible under the right conditions. Bone survives if it's buried quickly in the right kind of sediment. Shell preserves well in certain environments. But wood, plant fibres, leather, feathers, most organic materials, these are almost never preserved beyond a few thousand years, except in extraordinary circumstances, frozen in permafrost, desiccated in deserts, waterlogged in bogs. So the behaviours that required stone, bone and shell look prominent in the archaeological record, not necessarily because they were the most important, but because they happen to leave durable traces. The behaviours that required perishable materials, baskets, nets, wooden spears, painted skin clothing, most forms of music and ritual simply don't show up, which means we are looking at a record full of systematic absences, and we have to hold that in mind constantly. This connects directly to the central debate around what researchers call behavioural modernity. The term refers to a cluster of behaviours that seem to distinguish fully modern human cognition from what came before. Symbolic thinking, abstract art, systematic blade production, long-distance trade, intentional burials, personal ornamentation, elaborate planning of the hunt. For a long time, many researchers treated these as a package, something that appeared together, more or less at once, around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago in Europe, as modern humans arrived and Neanderthals began to disappear. This was sometimes called the Creative Revolution, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, and it had a satisfying narrative logic to it. Something clicked. A threshold was crossed, and suddenly humans were modern. The problem is that the African evidence doesn't cooperate with that story. In South Africa, in Morocco, in the Congo, researchers have found evidence of symbolic behaviour reaching back 100,000 years, and in some cases further. Ochre processed and mixed in shell containers at Blombos Cave, dated to around 75,000 years ago. Perforated shell beads from sites in North Africa, going back to at least 130,000 years. Engraved geometric patterns on ochre from even earlier. These aren't isolated finds. There's a growing body of evidence suggesting that the behaviours associated with modern cognition didn't suddenly appear 50,000 years ago. They emerged earlier, probably patchily, probably in Africa first, and then spread, disappeared, re-emerged, accumulated slowly over a much longer period than the revolution story implies. So the cleaner alternative model is a mosaic. Behavioural modernity not as a single package that switches on, but as a collection of traits that developed unevenly in different places at different times, sometimes appearing in the record and then vanishing for thousands of years before reappearing again. Maybe certain behaviours were invented more than once. Maybe some innovations spread and then were lost when the groups that developed them declined. The record doesn't look like a light being switched on. It looks more like a fire being built in the wind, catching here, sputtering out, catching again somewhere else, until eventually enough embers are burning together that it becomes self-sustaining. The tension between revolution and gradual accumulation is one of the genuine fault lines in the field right now. And it matters for how you interpret everything that follows. If something crossed a biological threshold around 50,000 years ago, some final rewiring of language or cognition, then all the earlier African evidence becomes prologue, and the acceleration is real. If it was purely cultural accumulation, building slowly over a much longer time, then 50,000 years ago isn't a turning point so much as a visibility threshold, the point at which the fire was burning hot enough to leave a clear mark in the record. Keeping that tension in mind, there are a handful of regions that are going to keep coming up as we move through this story, and it's worth knowing their roles from the start. Sub-Saharan Africa is where the earliest evidence tends to cluster, and where modern humans have the deepest roots, North Africa adds its own distinct record, connected to but separate from the south. The Levant, that corridor connecting Africa and Eurasia, is where populations mixed and moved. Europe offers the most thoroughly excavated record, particularly from the period after 45,000 years ago, which creates a distortion because Europe was not the centre of this story, just the most studied part of it. Central and East Asia carry evidence of Denisovan presence and modern human expansion. Island Southeast Asia raises some of the most challenging questions about seafaring and early dispersal, and Australia, reached by at least 65,000 years ago, sits at the far end of one of the most remarkable journeys in human prehistory. Each of these regions adds a different piece, and in almost every case the evidence is incomplete, contested, and being actively revised, which is exactly why this is worth paying attention to. We're not reciting a settled history tonight. We're following a live investigation. And the investigators are still arguing about the clues. So when people talk about a cultural acceleration around 50,000 years ago, what are they actually pointing to? Not genes we can sequence, not brains we can put in a scanner, but things, objects in the ground that seem to mean more than their immediate function. And the first category that always comes up is symbols. But that word, symbolic, carries more weight than it sounds like. It doesn't just mean looks nice or a bit fancy. In archaeology, symbolic usually means an object that stands for something else in a way that had to be understood socially. A bead that says, I belong to this group. A mark that doesn't help you cut meat, but might help you remember, or might help you pray. A pattern that has no practical purpose we can see, but shows that the maker could imagine meaning beyond the here and now. The earliest candidates are small and quiet. They don't look like revolutions. They look like bits of mineral and shell. One of the most famous is ochre, iron-rich earth, ranging from yellow through red to almost purple. Humans have been using it for a very long time, possibly before our own species appeared. It's soft, easy to grind, and if you mix it with fat or water, it becomes paint. We know Neanderthals used pigments. We know earlier hominins did too. So, on its own, ochre isn't a slam dunk for symbolism. What makes archaeologists pay attention is context and treatment. In caves like Blombos in South Africa, we find ochre that has been carefully selected for colour and texture, deliberately ground, sometimes shaped. There are pieces with cross-hatched engravings, lines scored into the surface in repeating patterns. There are abalone shells that seem to have been used as mixing bowls for pigment, complete with residues of a complex mixture, crushed ochre, bone, charcoal, fat. It looks very much like someone was preparing paint according to a recipe. Is that art? Is that ritual, maybe? Or maybe it's body paint to protect skin, or a sunscreen, or an insect repellent, or all of the above. One plausible view is that practical uses and symbolic uses are tangled together. If everyone in your group routinely rubs red pigment on their skin because it helps with the sun, you've also created an automatic badge of membership. Colour becomes identity. What starts as chemistry can turn into culture. Then there are beads. Tiny perforated shells, usually from marine species, found in layers far inland, dated in some African and North African sites to over 100,000 years ago. Some have wear around the holes that suggests they were strung and rubbed against skin or clothing for a long time. In a Moroccan cave, dozens of similar shells show up together, as if someone had an entire kit of ornaments. A shell with a hole could, in theory, just be natural. A snail might have drilled it, rock action could have broken it. But when you find many shells of the same kind, all with similarly placed perforations, many far from the sea, sometimes with grinding around the edges, you're not looking at chance anymore. You're looking at standardization, at people deliberately collecting, modifying, and wearing objects for reasons that are unlikely to be purely practical. Personal ornaments are powerful signals. They can say, we are the same kind of people across distances and generations. They can mark adulthood or status or a special role. They can show alliances, marriages, debts. You can see this in modern small-scale societies, where bead colours and arrangements can map whole social landscapes. It's not a stretch to imagine something similar 100,000 years ago. The specific meanings are lost, but the underlying logic is familiar. Bodies as billboards for identity. Engravings add another layer. Apart from the marked ochre, we have bone, stone, and even the walls of shelters with carved lines and geometric patterns. Not realistic pictures at first, more like grids, chevrons, zigzags. Some researchers interpret these as the earliest steps toward notation, external memory aids. Others see them as doodles or purely aesthetic patterning, the way humans everywhere seem to enjoy symmetry and repetition. And both possibilities are interesting. Even a doodle suggests a mind that can play with form, that has no direct survival value. If you fast forward along the timeline toward Europe, the evidence becomes more dramatic. By around 40,000 years ago, and especially between 35,000 and 25,000, we get the famous deep cave paintings, Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira. Horses, bison, mammoths, lions, rhinos, rendered with a grace that still feels shocking. Hand stencils blown around with pigment, abstract signs appearing again and again, dots, ladders, branching lines. It's tempting to say, here, finally, is the revolution. This is where symbolic behaviour really explodes, but even here the ground is shakier than it looks. Dating cave art is hard. Sometimes the pigments themselves can be radiocarbon dated. Sometimes there are thin films of calcite grown over the paint that can be dated with uranium series methods, providing a minimum age. Sometimes archaeologists rely on the age of nearby hearths or bones in the same cave chamber, which may or may not be exactly contemporary with the paintings. Different methods can give different results. New analyses have pushed some art older, some younger. There are debates about whether some of the earliest European paintings were made by modern humans or Neanderthals. The headlines move faster than the consensus. And then there's the visibility problem. Deep painted caves are impressive, in part because they survive so well. Protected from weather, sealed in darkness, they can last tens of thousands of years. If equally sophisticated artists were painting exposed rock faces, or their own bodies, or wooden objects in Africa 20,000 years earlier, we would almost never know. So it may not be that Europe suddenly became more creative. It may be that Europe, by geological luck, turned out to be a better archive. Still, by this point, personal ornaments are everywhere. Teeth drilled for suspension. Beads made not just of shell, but of bone, ivory, even stone painstakingly shaped. In some sites, hundreds of beads were sewn onto clothing or arranged on burials. The sheer labour investment is staggering. You don't make a necklace of 200 tiny beads because you're bored for an afternoon. You're expressing something that matters in your social world. What exactly did all this symbolism do? There are several competing ideas, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is social ornaments and body paint help manage relationships in growing, more complex networks. They advertise who you are at a glance, reducing the risk of conflict, smoothing trade, signalling who you can marry. They're like portable passports in a world with no writing. Another is ritual. Certain patterns and colours might have been associated with spirits, ancestors, seasonal events. Engravings and paintings could mark sacred spaces, encode myths or guide ceremonies. Symbolic marks might have helped humans collectively imagine things that weren't physically present. The herd to be hunted, the storm to be appeased, the dead to be remembered. A third is status and competition. Costly ornaments, ones that take time, rare materials, skill can work as honest signals of success, bravery or generosity. If you can afford to give time to bead making instead of pure subsistence, maybe that says something about your hunting ability, your allies, or your luck. And then there's the possibility that some of it really is aesthetic play. Humans seem to enjoy pattern, rhythm, colour. Making beautiful things may simply feel good, and that pleasure could then be harnessed for social and ritual purposes. The line between art for art's sake and art for society's sake might not have been sharp at all. Regionally, the pattern looks less like a single wave and more like overlapping ripples. In sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, we see early beads, processed ochre, engravings going back well past 100,000 years. In the Levant, there are ornaments and pigments, associated with both early modern humans and Neanderthals. In Europe, there's a remarkable flourish of cave art, sculpted figurines and complex ornaments after about 45,000 years ago. In Siberia and East Asia, symbolic objects appear later in the record, but that may partly reflect less excavation and more challenging preservation conditions. In Australia, rock art traditions stretch back tens of thousands of years, though direct dating is again difficult and debated. So, is this a cultural acceleration? In one sense, yes. When you look at the density of symbolic artifacts per site, per region, there does seem to be a thickening of the record starting roughly around the 50,000-year mark and becoming unmistakable by 40,000. There are more sites with ornaments, more engravings, more varied use of pigments, more clear evidence that people were investing energy and meaning beyond the immediate. But we have to be cautious. The further back in time you go, the fewer sites survive, the more fragile the evidence, the bigger the dating errors. An absence of beads in a layer from 90,000 years ago doesn't mean no one anywhere was wearing them. It might mean their beads were made of plant material that rotted, or that the one group who favoured them lived in a region that hasn't been excavated yet, or that their cave roof collapsed and crushed the whole record beyond recognition. So when we talk about a turning point, we're really talking about a change in visibility. At some point in the Late Pleistocene, symbolic behaviour, art, ornaments, deliberate marks becomes common enough, widespread enough, and durable enough that it leaves a clear trace across multiple regions. That could reflect a deep shift in cognition or language. It could reflect slowly accumulating traditions finally reaching a critical mass. Or it could be, at least in part, an artifact of where and how we've been able to look. What's clear is that by the time we get to that window around 50,000 years ago, humans are no longer just reacting to their environment. They're reimagining it and themselves through symbols, and that sets the stage for another invisible technology that would bind those symbols together into stories, laws, myths and plans. Language. Language is the missing piece that refuses to sit still. We feel like it must be there, behind the beads and the burials and the painted walls. But unlike ochre or bone or shell, it doesn't leave a fossil. It's an invisible technology running on wet, fragile hardware that never makes it into the geological record. That's the first problem. We can't dig up a sentence. All we have are clues, shapes of bones, traces in genes, patterns in tools and in the way people seem to have organized their lives. From these, researchers try to reconstruct not just whether our ancestors could make sounds, but what kinds of meanings they might have woven with them. If you start with anatomy, the picture is already complicated. Modern humans have a particular vocal tract, a descended larynx, a flexible tongue, fine control over breathing. These features let us produce an astonishing range of sounds, from the hiss of an S to the deep rumble of a vowel. For a long time, some scientists thought this configuration was uniquely modern and relatively recent, a late arriving upgrade. Then Neanderthals ruined that simple story. We found Neanderthal hyoid bones, the small horseshoe-shaped bones in the throat that help support the tongue and the larynx that look strikingly like ours. Their inner ear structures suggest sensitivity to roughly the same frequency range as human speech. The spaces in their skulls where nerves ran to control the tongue and lips are generous. The shape of their rib cages implies they had good breath control, potentially useful for long, modulated vocalizations. None of this proves they had language in the way we do. You can't look at a bone and know if its owner told stories about the dead or argued about hunting rights. But the idea that Neanderthals were grunting brutes, physically incapable of speech-like sounds, is very hard to defend now. Their throats and chests and ears look a lot like throats and chests and ears that talk. And if Neanderthals had the hardware, it raises an obvious question. When did that hardware evolve? Probably well before the famous 50,000-year revolution, some estimates push the emergence of a near-modern vocal tract back at least several 100,000 years, maybe even to the common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. Genes associated with speech and language like FOXP2 also appear to have older histories than once thought. The basic toolkit for complex vocal communication may have been in place long before we see an explosion of art or ornaments. So the bones tell us what our ancestors could have done with their voices. They don't tell us what they actually did. To get closer to that, we have to look at cognition and behavior, the kinds of things that seem to require complex language to work smoothly. Think about planning. Not just walk over there and pick up that fruit, but planning that unfolds over days or seasons. Coordinated drives of large animals, scheduled meetings with other bands to exchange mates or goods. The use of distant stone sources or shell from the sea, moved inland through chains of people who probably never met the original collectors. These activities show up in the archaeological record long before 50,000 years ago. They suggest minds capable of thinking ahead, holding multiple steps in mind, and coordinating those steps with others. You can, in theory, manage some of this with gestures, pointing, and simple calls. But as the chains of cooperation get longer, the room for misunderstanding grows. Language makes it easier to say, "You go there, then wait 3 days. If the herd hasn't arrived, send a runner," instead of relying on a few signals and hope. Teaching is another clue. Many prehistoric technologies are not obvious from looking at the finished product. A shaped stone tool belies hours of practice, a particular sequence of strikes, a sense of how force travels through rock. Compound tools like a stone point attached to a wooden shaft with adhesive require knowledge of glue recipes, curing times, and binding techniques. These things are very hard to learn just by watching from a distance. Modern hunter-gatherer children are taught with words, patient explanations, corrections, stories that embed rules and warnings. They also learn by imitation, of course, but language thickens the process. The earlier humans began to rely on complex, multi-step technologies. The more useful spoken instruction would have become, even if that instruction started as relatively simple phrases. Then there is cooperation itself. Large game hunts, shared childcare, trading partnerships, conflict mediation. These all run more smoothly when you can talk not just about what is happening now, but about what happened before and what might happen next. Language lets you negotiate, promise, gossip, threaten, joke. It gives you social tools for holding alliances together and for repairing them when they crack. Some researchers argue that the real threshold in language wasn't just a bigger vocabulary or clearer sounds, but a structural change in how our ancestors could think in words. One candidate is recursion, the ability to embed ideas within ideas, phrases within phrases. The man who came yesterday is the brother of the woman we will visit tomorrow. Sentences like that let you pack complex relationships into a single communicative burst. Another candidate is narrative, the ability to string events into coherent stories with causes and consequences, heroes and villains, lessons and warnings. Storytelling doesn't leave a direct trace, but its fingerprints might be in those earliest burials, in the careful placement of bodies and objects that suggest people were imagining journeys after death, or in the repeated animal images on cave walls that may have been linked to myths. Once a group has shared stories, it can also have shared myths, explanations of where the group came from, why certain places are sacred, why certain rules must be followed. These myths can bind people across generations, turning scattered individuals into a community that feels it has a common past and a common destiny. That's a powerful social technology, and language is the medium that carries it. Was there a single moment when all of this switched on around 50,000 years ago? Some theories lean that way. They imagine a genetic tweak that suddenly allowed recursive syntax, or a cultural tipping point where vocabulary size and social complexity crossed a line and everything took off. But there's another possibility, and many researchers now favour some version of it. Sophisticated language might be much older, and what changes later is how thoroughly it's used and how well it's preserved in material culture. In this view, the ancestors of Neanderthals, Denisovans and modern humans may all have had rich spoken languages hundreds of thousands of years ago. They could already talk about absent things, coordinate hunts, name individuals, perhaps even tell simple stories. Over time, as populations grew, climates fluctuated, and social networks became more intricate, the pressure to use that language in more elaborate ways would have intensified. What we see around 50,000 years ago, then, wouldn't be the birth of language, but the moment when language, culture, and demography lock into a new feedback loop. Language allows you to describe a new tool in detail, or to teach someone how to knap a particular kind of blade without them spending 10 years reinventing it. It lets you pass on tips about where to find seasonal foods, how to prepare toxic plants safely, how to avoid dangerous cliffs or spirits or neighbouring groups. Each generation doesn't have to rediscover everything. They can inherit not just genes and tools, but recipes, taboos and tricks of the trade. That's what people mean by cumulative culture. Knowledge and practices that build up over time, accumulating like layers in a midden heap. Once language is good enough, it becomes the main channel for that accumulation. It lets innovations spread horizontally between groups and vertically down the generations. A clever idea doesn't die with its inventor. It can be talked about, ritualized, taught, improved. In a world of small, scattered bands, this matters enormously. If one group stumbles on a better hunting strategy or a new way to stitch clothing and can explain it clearly to allies, that advantage can ripple outward. Trade networks don't just move shells and stone, they move sentences. So when you look at that thickening record of symbols around 50,000 years ago, beads, pigments, engravings, and later the dramatic cave paintings, it's reasonable to suspect that something about language had also thickened. Maybe vocabularies had expanded to cover more abstract concepts. Maybe grammatical structures had become more flexible, allowing people to nest thoughts and play with time. Maybe shared stories had become more elaborate, binding larger communities together. We can't hear those voices, but we can see what happened when their words began to shape not just tools and hunts, but identities and beliefs. And once language and culture were locked in that kind of spiral, another part of the human machine started to change as well, the social brain that had to manage all those new relationships and rules. If language is the wiring, the social brain is the power grid it plugs into. Humans don't just think with words in their heads, they think with other people. Every decision about where to move, what to eat, who to trust, and who to mate with is embedded in a web of relationships. Around 50,000 years ago, that web seems to have thickened and stretched in new ways. To see why this matters, imagine a world of tiny bands again. 20, maybe 30 people, a few extended families, some in-laws, a handful of children. In a group like this, everyone knows everyone else's history. Who shares food? Who cheats? Who is generous with childcare? Who gets angry fast? You don't need elaborate institutions for that. Face-to-face memory is enough. If someone betrays you, you remember. If someone helps you, you remember that too. Reputation lives inside brains that see each other every day. Now zoom out and imagine a world where your band is not alone. You have neighbouring groups you see once or twice a year. There are distant cousins days or weeks away, people your grandparents talk about but you've never met. There are vague stories of others beyond them, who have shells from a coast you've never seen or stone from a mountain you don't have a name for. Suddenly, social scale starts to matter. The larger the network, the more information can flow. News about an animal herd's migration can leapfrog from group to group. Knowledge of a new tool, a better fishing technique, or a safe plant can spread far beyond the person who first figured it out. Warnings about dangerous neighbours, or about a disease, can move in the same way. Mate exchange matters too. In very small, isolated bands, people end up marrying close kin generation after generation. Over time, that can be risky. Genetic diversity shrinks. Harmful mutations have fewer ways to hide. When multiple bands are linked through regular visits and alliance rituals, it becomes possible to exchange partners over wider distances. This doesn't just reduce inbreeding, it also moves genes and ideas at the same time. A bride doesn't just bring her bloodline, she brings songs, recipes and taboos. Mutual aid is another piece. If your entire world is one band and disaster hits, bad winter, failed hunt, sudden illness, your options are limited. You suffer together or you die together. But if your band is part of a wider fabric of alliances, the picture changes. You can travel to your in-laws' camp when game grows scarce. They can shelter with you when a fire sweeps through their valley. Over decades, different groups might take turns being the helpers and the helped. This is where those network effects that economists and computer scientists talk about start to apply to prehistory. A single group that invents a clever trick has an advantage. Dozens of connected groups that can pass that trick along can transform an entire region's survival strategy. The archaeological record gives us hints that these wider networks were becoming more important around the time we see that cultural acceleration. Long-distance exchange is one of the strongest clues. People in inland sites far from the sea are buried with marine shells. Stone tools at one camp are made of rock from a quarry, hundreds of kilometers away. Pigments from specific mineral sources show up repeatedly across wide areas. These materials didn't float there by accident. They moved in human hands, probably through chains of people who mostly knew each other only through stories and obligations. If you can trace a piece of obsidian across hundreds of kilometers, you're not just looking at trade. You're looking at a map of social ties. Of course, this kind of network doesn't run on good intentions alone. You can trust your brother because you grew up with him. But how do you trust someone you see once a year, or someone you've never met, but who belongs to a group your grandparents made a promise to? This is where the social brain gets busy. One way humans manage this is through ritual. Shared dances, songs, and ceremonies that mark who is us. These might involve painful ordeals, long fasts, or complex sequences of movement and sound. From a strictly practical perspective, they look like a waste of time and energy. From a social perspective, they are investment. If you're willing to suffer through an initiation rite with me or pour precious pigment onto your body as part of a shared performance, you're signaling commitment. You're showing that you value the group enough to bear costs. Groups with demanding rituals can, in theory, weed out free riders who want the benefits of membership without the sacrifices. Symbols help in a similar way. Particular bead styles, ways of cutting hair, patterns painted on skin or carved into tools can function like early team jerseys. They tell you at a glance who belongs to which network and who follows which rules. Some archaeologists think the sudden spread of standardized ornaments and markings in this period reflects exactly this: identity broadcast over distance. Reputations extend the system beyond the present moment. It's not just what you do in front of me that matters. It's what I've heard you did last season, or what my cousin says you did 2 years ago. Gossip, those seemingly idle stories about who cheated in a trade, who was brave in a hunt, who broke a taboo, becomes a powerful tool. Language doesn't just coordinate hunts, it coordinates trust and punishment. Shared norms and myths bind this all together. If different bands see themselves as descendants of a common ancestor, or as stewards of a common sacred place, they have reasons to cooperate that go beyond immediate gain. They may have rules about generosity to guests, about how to settle disputes, about who has the right to marry whom. These rules can be remembered, recited, and enforced across distances. They give structure to relationships that extend beyond the small circle of daily life. Compare the dynamics of a single small band to a multi-band alliance that meets seasonally. In the small band, conflicts are personal. Resources are managed locally. Innovation spreads at the speed of one family teaching another. When things go wrong, everyone affected is physically present. In a multi-band seasonal aggregation, everything stretches. A single gathering might involve dozens or hundreds of people. Courtships are arranged, old feuds are settled or reignited. Traders move through, exchanging information as well as goods. Storytellers perform tales that knit the whole assembly into a shared mental world, where we came from, what we owe, who betrayed whom in the distant past. During the rest of the year, these bands will be scattered, each managing its own territory. But because they come together regularly, they can share languages, styles, and norms. They can coordinate movements to avoid overhunting certain areas. They can decide in some fuzzy, negotiated way which valleys belong to which families. These larger configurations put new demands on cognition. You have to remember not just individuals, but relationships between groups. Not just who is your friend, but who is your friend's ally. Your brain starts carrying a mental map of social space as complex as the physical landscape. From an evolutionary perspective, this has consequences. Individuals who are slightly better at reading others' intentions, at tracking obligations, or at using language to repair damaged relationships will have advantages in these expanded networks. Over many generations, selection might favour brains tuned for exactly the kinds of social thinking we now take for granted: empathy, perspective-taking, sensitivity to status and fairness. And there is the resilience angle. Networks act like insurance. If rainfall fails in one valley but not another, and if those valleys are linked by kinship and ritual, famine in one place doesn't have to mean extinction. People can move along pre-existing routes, calling in favours, offering future obligations in return. If a cold snap wipes out a key animal population in one region, hunters can switch to new grounds or new prey, drawing on knowledge they heard in stories told at last year's gathering. Sometimes these networks would break. Trust would fail. Cooperation would collapse into violence. Not every alliance held, not every band survived. But on average, populations stitched together by broader ties would be more robust than isolated ones. So, when we look at the apparent surge in symbolic objects, long-distance materials, and complex sites around 50,000 years ago, one way to read it is as evidence of a social tipping point. Brains, language, and culture had been co-evolving for a long time. Now they were being woven into systems that exceeded the scale of any single face-to-face group. Our ancestors weren't just living with a few relatives anymore. They were learning to belong to networks, overlapping circles of kin, allies, trading partners, and story sharers. In that widening social world, another transformation was brewing, not just in the tools they carried, but in the way they made and combined them. When you picture Stone Age tools, your mind might jump to a simple hand axe. A lump of rock chipped on both sides, heavy in the palm, good for many things but perfect for none. By the time we get to around 50,000 years ago, in many parts of the world that picture is out of date, think instead of a toolkit that looks less like a single all-purpose hammer and more like a box of specialized attachments. Long, narrow stone blades that can be snapped into smaller pieces, tiny, sharp microliths shaped like geometric fragments, points, scrapers, burins, all designed to be swapped in and out of handles and shafts as needed. Earlier in human history, a tool was often the whole stone. Now, increasingly, the stone is just one component. People are thinking in modules. Blade-based industries are one of the clearest signs of this shift. Instead of hitting a rock randomly until something useful appears, toolmakers prepare a stone core in advance so that thin blades can be struck off in sequence, a bit like slicing pieces from a loaf. Each blade can then be retouched into a knife, a projectile point, or snapped into microliths and set along a wooden or bone shaft like teeth. This kind of planning doesn't just happen in the hands. It happens in the mind. You have to imagine the final tool not as a single object, but as an assembly of parts, core, blade, backing, binding. You have to know that a single chunk of good stone can yield several interchangeable components. It's an early form of manufacturing strategy. Microliths, those tiny, carefully shaped pieces, push the idea even further. On their own, they are too small to do much, but inserted into grooves in wood or bone, fixed with resin and bindings, they become composite knives, barbed spears, fishing harpoons. When a tip breaks, you don't throw away the whole spear, you replace the damaged element. The toolkit becomes maintainable, upgradable. If this sounds a little like modern modular design, that's not an accident. Once you start thinking in terms of replaceable parts, a lot of possibilities open up. Stone isn't the only material that tells this story. Around the same broad window, we start seeing much more systematic use of what archaeologists call organic tools: bone, antler, and ivory shaped into finely tuned instruments. These materials had been used before, but now they start appearing in forms that speak to very specific tasks. Slender bone points that might serve as barbs for harpoons, tapered antler tips that act as tough, flexible spearheads, and perhaps most transformative of all, bone needles with drilled eyes. A needle with an eye is a small revolution. With it, you can pull thread through hides and plant fibres, not just punch holes. You can stitch tightly, shaping clothing that fits the body, closing gaps against wind and cold. You can quilt, layer, and repair. In cold regions, this can be the difference between enduring a winter and freezing. Ivory and antler lend themselves to different properties. They can flex slightly without snapping, absorb shock, and take a fine polish. That makes them ideal for parts of tools that take repeated impacts. The end of a spear that hits bone, the tip of a digging stick used in hard soil. Once again, we see modular thinking. Combine hard stone edges, resilient organic shafts, and flexible tips in one integrated design. To make such tools work, you need more than shapes. You need ways to join materials together. This is where compound technologies enter the picture: hafting, adhesives, and bindings. A sharp stone flake is useful. A sharp stone flake firmly attached to a handle with resin and sinew is an entirely different category of tool. Hafting, fixing a stone piece to a shaft or handle, requires multi-step procedures. You gather plant fibres, twist them into cordage, you strip animal sinew, soak it and wrap it so that it tightens as it dries. You heat plant resins or tree pitches just enough to soften them without burning, sometimes mixing in mineral powders or charcoal to create stronger glues. You prepare a groove in wood or bone, seat the stone piece, apply adhesive, bind it all together, and let it cure. That's chemistry and engineering, even if no one is writing formulas. Some residues on ancient tools show complex recipes, pitches that had to be heated, cooled and reheated, mixtures that require precise timing and attention to temperature. Experiments by modern researchers suggest that getting these adhesives right is not trivial. Do it badly and the spear point flies off or the tool shatters in your hand at the worst possible time. This implies not just invention but tradition. Someone had to discover that a particular plant exudate becomes sticky when heated. Someone else had to realize that mixing in ash makes it less brittle. These tricks then had to be passed on in enough detail that others could repeat them reliably. Here the social and the technological fuse. You can't learn multi-step failure-prone procedures just by glancing over now and then. High-fidelity skill transmission becomes essential. Children and apprentices may have watched closely as elders worked, their hands guided, their mistakes corrected. There might have been specialized tool makers, people recognized for their steady hands and good judgment. Imitation alone doesn't quite capture it. To reproduce a complex tool, you need to copy not only the final shape, but the hidden sequence, which raw materials to gather, what order to process them in, how long to wait between steps, how something should sound or feel when it's right. Language fits into this system as well, but much of it can be embodied, gestures, demonstrations, rituals that scaffold memory. Around 50,000 years ago, in several regions, we see an apparent clustering of these innovations. More advanced blades, microliths, organic tools and compound technologies start showing up together more often. Why then? Why in clusters? One idea points to population size and density. When there are more people, there are more tinkerers. The odds that someone somewhere will stumble onto a clever combination rise. And when groups are connected through the kinds of networks we talked about earlier, successful innovations don't stay local. They can spread, be copied, modified, and recombined. Culture starts evolving in something like an arms race with the environment. Another idea focuses on competition. As populations grow and landscapes fill, neighbours become rivals as well as allies. Groups with better spears, more reliable clothing, or more efficient food processing tools might outcompete others, pushing them into harsher habitats or wiping them out entirely. Under these pressures, even small improvements in tool performance can have big consequences over generations. Environmental variability is another suspect. Periods of rapid climate fluctuation demand flexibility. Modular, repairable, multi-part tools are exactly the kind of technology that lets you pivot quickly. New prey, new plants, new hunting grounds, all can be addressed by reconfiguring the same basic toolkit. But it's important not to imagine this as a single global aha moment when everyone suddenly stepped into modernity. The archaeological record doesn't show a neat, synchronized revolution. Instead, it shows different regions taking different paths. In some African sites, complex blade and microlith industries appear quite early. In parts of Europe, bone tools and sophisticated hafting become prominent somewhat later, sometimes associated with particular cultures. In Asia and Australia, the sequences differ again, with local materials and environments shaping what counts as an effective tool. Some areas show long periods where older technologies persist alongside newer ones. Others seem to leap ahead and then plateau. There are also gaps in the record, places and times we simply haven't found yet. What looks like a sudden cluster from our vantage point may, in reality, be a patchwork of local experiments stitched together imperfectly by what we happen to have dug up. So when we talk about blades, bone needles and compound tools around 50,000 years ago, it might be more accurate to think of overlapping waves than of a single rising tide. In camp after camp, valley after valley, people were learning to break the world into parts and put it back together again in new forms. Stone and bone, fibre and resin, knowledge and practice, each became a component in a growing system of technology. By the time your ancestors were using these modular toolkits as a matter of course, they were doing something more than sharpening rocks. They were building an external layer of capability around their bodies, a flexible shell of inventions that could change faster than their genes ever could. Wrapped in that shell, carrying blades and needles and hafted points, they were ready to push into new kinds of landscapes and to unlock new sources of energy. The next transformation would come from something as simple and as profound as the way they controlled fire and treated their food. Fire had been with humans for a very long time by the time we get to this story. There are traces of controlled fire going back hundreds of thousands of years. Hearths, charcoal, burned bones in caves. So this isn't a tale where one day, 50,000 years ago, somebody suddenly invented fire and everything changed. The question is subtler. If fire was already old, what changed about how people used it? Archaeologists talk less about discovery and more about control, specialization and scale. Early hearths look sporadic, patchy in the record. A fire here, a cluster there. Hard to tell whether people were keeping flames going constantly or just grabbing natural fires when they could. By the later Pleistocene, especially in some African and Eurasian sites associated with our own species, we start seeing more consistent evidence of well-maintained hearths, layers of ash, repeated burning in the same spots. Different zones in a shelter used for different fire-related activities. That suggests people weren't just borrowing fire from lightning anymore. They were treating it as a permanent part of camp life, something you tended, managed, maybe even specialized in. There's also the question of what fire was for. You can use it to scare off predators, to clear brush, to harden wooden spear tips. Earlier humans almost certainly did all that. But cooking, really relying on cooked food as the default rather than the exception, that seems to have gathered force over time. Here the evidence is both strong and indirect. We know from biology that cooking changes food. It breaks down tough fibers, denatures proteins, softens starches. That means more calories from the same bite, and less work by your jaw and gut. Human teeth and digestive tracts look more like those of an animal that eats soft, calorie-dense foods than like a raw plant muncher. Some researchers argue this points to a deep history of cooking, perhaps well before 50,000 years ago. If that's right, then what's new later on isn't the idea of cooking itself, but how thoroughly daily life becomes organized around it. Imagine a camp where cooking fires are going almost every evening. Meat roasted, tubers baked, seeds parched, roots simmered in hot stones and water-filled skins. People gather, wait, talk, children hang close, absorbing not just warmth and smells, but stories, instructions, warnings, jokes. Cooking doesn't just feed bodies, it stretches time. Raw diets require hours and hours of chewing and foraging. Cooked food can be eaten faster and digested more easily. That freed up time has to go somewhere. One leading idea is that it poured into social learning, longer conversations, more detailed teaching, more elaborate stories, more chances for elders to explain how to make that pitch adhesive just right, or when the salmon will run. We can't watch these scenes. We infer them from converging lines of evidence, anatomical hints that cooking is old, hearths becoming more common and organized, and the obvious fact that fire and language together create evening spaces where culture can thicken. Fire also lets you reach into new corners of the menu. Earlier hominins ate meat, plants, probably some insects and scavenged marrow. But by the time we're in the world of late Pleistocene modern humans, the diet seems to expand in several directions at once. In some coastal African sites, we find dense heaps of shellfish remains and fish bones, sometimes associated with sophisticated stone and bone tools. People are exploiting tidal zones, timing their trips to the rhythm of the moon, roasting shellfish on coals, drying strips of fish, in river valleys and lakeshore camps, charred fish bones and harpoon-like points hint at freshwater fishing. Small game also steps into the spotlight. Trapping and snaring small animals doesn't show up directly in stone, but certain tool types and cut-marked bones suggest more systematic use of rabbits, birds, and other fast-reproducing species. In some regions, the bone assemblages shift from mainly large, risky animals to a broader mix that includes many small, predictable ones. Plants, too, seem to get more attention, not just as occasional snacks, but as processed resources. Grinding stones with traces of plant starch, charred seeds and nuts that show signs of heating. In a few sites, the pattern suggests that people were collecting large amounts of small, fussy foods, wild grains, nuts with hard shells, starchy roots, and then transforming them with fire and pounding into something more digestible and storable. Here we have to be careful. A grinding stone doesn't automatically mean daily porridge, and a pile of shells doesn't prove year-round seafood dependence. Many of these sites give us snapshots rather than full diaries. But taken together, the trend points toward diet broadening. Instead of relying heavily on a narrow band of big game plus whatever else turned up, more groups seem to be systematically tapping fish, shellfish, small mammals, and a wider range of plants. Fire, once again, is the enabling technology. It makes many of these foods safer, tastier, and energetically worthwhile. And once you can cook well, a new idea becomes increasingly valuable: storage. If you can dry strips of meat over smoke or roast nuts to keep them from going rancid or parch grains to drive out moisture, you're not just eating in the present. You're banking calories for later. Archaeologists call this delayed return subsistence. Instead of an immediate feedback loop, hunt, eat, repeat, people invest labour now for payoffs days, weeks, or months down the line. We see hints of this in various forms. Large accumulations of processed bones in some Neanderthal and modern human sites suggest mass kills, followed by drying or caching. Shell middens may represent repeated harvesting and possibly surplus production. Pits, rock crevices, or cave recesses with concentrated food residues point to stashes. The record here is patchy and controversial. Some supposed storage pits might turn out to be natural depressions. Not every pile of bones means jerky, but the combination of mass harvesting, processing tools, and repeated occupation of the same favourable spots suggests that at least some groups were thinking beyond today's meal. Planning for delayed returns changes more than diet. It reshapes minds and social life. If winter survival depends on meat dried months earlier, then someone has to remember where the caches are, protect them from scavengers, and coordinate when to use them. Group members may have to trust that others won't raid stored food prematurely, or at least that any early use will be compensated later. Rules, expectations, maybe even early ownership concepts begin to matter more. Fire and storage together create a temporal bridge. Energy from the past flows into the future through technology and social agreement. All of this, cooking, broadening diets, storing food, ties into one big theme: flexibility. The late Pleistocene climate was not stable. Temperatures swung, rainfall patterns shifted, coastlines moved as ice sheets grew and shrank. Environments flipped between relatively lush and brutally lean on timescales that could matter within a few human lifetimes. In such a world, a narrow niche is a risky bet. If you're specialised only in hunting one kind of big animal, and that animal's range shifts or collapses, you're in trouble. But if you can shift from antelope to shellfish to small game to roasted roots, if you can lean on stored nuts during a bad season, if you know which plants can be detoxified by boiling or roasting, your odds improve. This is one reason many researchers see dietary breadth and fire-based food processing as core to what made our lineage unusually resilient. Not because every group everywhere used fire the same way, or had the same menu, but because across many regions we see the capacity to change diets without having to change bodies. Still, we should resist tidy narratives. Some Neanderthal sites, for example, show evidence of meat-heavy diets with limited plant use. Others preserve micro-remains indicating cooked plants and varied resources. Some early modern human groups leaned hard into coastal foraging. Others focused on inland hunting. There was no single modern human diet that snapped into place 50,000 years ago. What seems to change is less a specific recipe and more an underlying strategy. Use fire to unlock more calories from more kinds of things. Store what you can, and weave these practices into social routines and shared knowledge. By the time your ancestors are sitting around reliable hearths, roasting fish, drying meat, grinding seeds, they've done something profound. They've begun to decouple their survival from the immediate mood of the landscape. They're starting to bend time with food, wrapped in clothing stitched with bone needles, equipped with modular tools, fueled by cooked and sometimes stored calories. They can now push into colder, drier and more unpredictable places than ever before. That's where we go next. The shelters they built, the garments they crafted, and how those new layers of protection let humans walk into some of the harshest corners of the Ice Age world and call them home. Clothing is one of those things we're sure people had, and almost never see. Leather, fur, plant fibres, sinew thread, those materials vanish quickly. They rot, they get eaten by bacteria and fungi, they leave almost nothing behind. So if you walked into most Ice Age camps and looked around with an archaeologist's eyes, 50,000 years later, you'd mostly find stone, bone, sometimes shell and charcoal. The fabric of daily life, literally, is gone. So instead of shirts and cloaks, we look for shadows. One of the clearest shadows is the humble sewing needle. Not just any pointy bit of bone, but a carefully shaped tool with a drilled eye at one end. That's not for poking holes in hides as you shove them together. It's for pulling a thread through, for real stitching. The oldest known-eyed needles come from sites in Siberia and northern China, roughly in the time window we're talking about and a bit later. These are regions where winters are brutally cold, where wind can strip heat from an unprotected body in minutes. Simple capes and loosely draped skins are not enough there. You need fitted clothing, leggings, sleeves, hoods, closed seams that trap warm air and keep snow and icy wind out. Those needles, tiny and easy to overlook in a dig, quietly announce an important shift. They tell us that at least some groups had gone beyond the wrap yourself in a hide stage into tailored garments, complex, multi-part outfits that required planning, skill and practice to make. We also see cut marks on animal bones that suggest careful skinning to preserve the hide, not just a rough removal to get at the meat. In some assemblages there are more fur-bearing animals than you'd expect if people only cared about calories. That hints that clothing, or at least hide use, was becoming a major part of the survival strategy. But again, there's no single invention of clothing moment we can point to. Different groups in different climates were probably using wraps, capes and belts far earlier, long before sewing needles show up. The needles just mark one end of a spectrum, where clothing becomes a refined craft with its own toolkit. Shelter is similar. We don't get blueprints, we get clues. Early hearths sometimes appear almost alone, a burned patch of ground in an otherwise open space. Later on, especially in some late Pleistocene modern human and Neanderthal sites, we start seeing more structured living spaces, hearths in consistent positions, clear activity zones, one area with stone flakes and bone debris, another with fewer artifacts, maybe where people slept. Sometimes there are rings of stones or arcs of post holes that suggest windbreaks or simple walls. In a few well-preserved sites, mammoth bones and tusks have been found arranged in circles or ovals, interpreted by many researchers as the foundations of large shelters. Whether all of these were full houses or sometimes just robust windbreaks is debated. But the pattern points the same way. People are building things to control microclimates around their bodies, not just huddling in whatever cave happens to exist. Even caves themselves, when used intensively, start to look like semi-permanent homes rather than temporary stops. Layers of occupation, rebuilt hearths in the same spots, trash zones swept to one side, sometimes rearranged rock features. A cave isn't just a hole anymore, it's an address. Along river terraces and open plains, archaeologists find scatters of artifacts that seem to map onto structures we can barely see. Light frameworks of wood or bone covered by hides, now long vanished. In tundra and steppe environments, traces of these structures line up with places where a slight shelter from the wind would make the difference between bone-deep chill and bearable cold. Put this together with clothing and you start to see a package. A body wrapped in stitched hide leggings and a fur-lined hood, stepping into a snug shelter with an organised hearth, is living inside several layers of insulation at once. Skin, clothing, air trapped in fibres, walls, and then the moving warm air from fire. Each layer reduces the energy cost of surviving in places where exposed flesh would freeze. This isn't just comfort, it's range expansion. As clothing becomes more effective and shelters more reliable, the season of possibility in cold and marginal landscapes extends. Places that might have been used only in brief summer forays, short hunting trips, fast resource grabs, can now hold people for longer stretches. Camps become winter bases, not just summer hunting blinds. That matters when we think about migration. To move north into Eurasia's higher latitudes, or up onto windy plateaus, or into continental interiors with harsh seasonal swings, you need more than courage. You need a way to make those places livable for enough of the year that children can grow up, elders can survive, and social memory can take root. Fitted clothing and durable shelters, backed by dependable fire and stored food, are what turn dangerous excursion into habitable range. At the same time, clothing and shelter aren't just about heat. They're about meaning. Once garments exist as constructed objects, stitched, adorned, cut to shape, they become canvases for identity. Different groups can favour different cuts, colours, furs, patterns of beads or pigment. In colder regions where much of the body is covered, the visible parts of clothing fringes, trim, hats, jewellery sewn onto hems may carry as much social information as hairstyles or painted skin do in warmer climates. Even if the archaeological traces are faint, pierced shells, small beads, bits of ochre rubbed smooth, we know that by around this time people were decorating themselves. It would be surprising if that didn't extend to their clothes and the items they wore on them. Clothing could signal age, sex, marital status, clan affiliation, achievements or ritual roles. Just as it does in many traditional societies today, shelters too can signal the layout of a camp, the size of a dwelling, the way hearths are placed, the presence of special structures for rituals or storage. These can all encode social rules and identities. Some late Pleistocene sites show repeated rebuilding in the same patterns, suggesting not just whatever works, but traditions about how a proper camp should look. Underneath all this is a stack of technologies and behaviours that work together like a nested system. Clothing on its own is helpful. Fire on its own is helpful. A solid shelter on its own is helpful. But the real breakthrough comes when fire-heated shelters, tailored clothing, food storage and long-term planning fuse into a single strategy. You need cooperative hunting or foraging to get enough hides and meat. You need skilled tanners to process those hides, tool makers to produce needles and scrapers, individuals who remember the right patterns for stitching a boot that won't leak. You need social norms that allow knowledge to be taught and passed down, and enough group stability that someone can specialise even a little bit in these tasks. All of this has to be coordinated in time. Hides must be cured before they rot, shelters readied before the worst weather hits, fuel gathered ahead of snow. That means anticipating seasonal cycles, remembering past winters, planning for ones that haven't happened yet. It's a mental as well as material architecture. And crucially, it's not the same everywhere. One of the striking things about the archaeological record around 50,000 years ago and after is how locally tuned many of these adaptations look. In one region, people may invest heavily in deep, well-protected cave sites, turning them into long-term bases. In another, mobile groups rely on light, quickly assembled shelters that can be carried or rebuilt as they follow migratory herds. Along coasts, clothing might be more about rain and wind protection than extreme cold. Inland, it's about snow and pounding blizzards. Needles appear early in some cold regions and only much later or not at all in others. Some groups seem to favour heavy fur-rich hides, others use layered textiles and leather. Shelter complexity varies. Some camps show evidence of multiple, carefully arranged structures. Others remain simple, seasonally reused spots with one or two hearths. This variability undercuts the idea of a single revolutionary clothing invention that suddenly unlocked the North. What we see instead are many small solutions, tuned to local environments, built on shared underlying capacities, the ability to plan ahead, cooperate, manipulate materials, and teach detailed skills. Still, when you zoom out, a pattern emerges. Across continents, in different forms and at different paces, humans start to wrap themselves in their own ingenuity. Garments that trap warmth, walls that blunt the wind, hearths that structure domestic space, social rules and shared memories that keep the system running. Step by step, they push the edge of the habitable world outward. Places that were once winter deserts, visited only by passing herds and hardy scavengers, become human landscapes, mapped, named, storied. And that expansion in turn feeds back into everything else. New territories mean new resources, new risks, new neighbours. The more of the planet humans can occupy, the more often different groups will eventually meet, sometimes to exchange tools and genes, sometimes to compete. Before we get to those encounters, though, we need to look at the backdrop that made all these experiments in clothing and shelter urgent, because none of this unfolded on a quiet, stable Earth. It was happening under skies that kept changing, in a climate that refused to sit still. The world your ancestors were wrapping themselves against was not a calm one. From our distance, Ice Age sounds like a single, steady condition. Snow, glaciers, mammoths on endless white plains. The reality, especially in the last 100,000 years or so, was much messier. Climate swung. Not every few million years, but sometimes within a few human lifetimes. Temperatures in parts of the North Atlantic region could jump several degrees in a matter of decades. Rainfall belts shifted north and south. Grasslands turned to scrub, then back to grassland. Forests advanced and retreated like slow-motion tides. Sea levels rose and fell by tens of meters as ice sheets grew and melted. If you could fly above Eurasia and Africa, sped up in time like a flickering film, you'd see habitats pulsing, tundra creeping south, then withdrawing. Steppe grasslands opening up where forests once stood, lakes swelling and then shrinking into salt pans. The Late Pleistocene was a world of patchiness. Instead of one continuous type of environment stretching for thousands of miles, you got mosaics. Cold uplands overlooking milder river valleys, dry plains bordering wetter refuges, strips of forest threaded through open country. Even within a single region, good years and bad years could look almost like different worlds. For a hunter-gatherer, this meant the map was never finished. The herd you counted on might shift its migratory route because snow lingered longer than usual. A once reliable spring could fail after a few dry years. A corridor that had been passable in your grandparents' time might be cut off by advancing ice or flooded by a rising meltwater lake. In a stable environment, you can afford to specialize. You learn how to exploit one niche very, very well. You stick to it. Your tools, your stories, your rituals all orbit the same predictable rhythms. In a world that keeps changing under your feet, specialization is dangerous. Instability rewards something else: flexibility. Groups that could read shifting conditions, experiment with new foods, adjust their seasonal rounds, and change where and how they lived would fare better than groups that clung stubbornly to old patterns. Over generations, this doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes culture. Think of it in terms of bets. Every year, your ancestors had to bet on where to move, what to hunt, which plants to gather, where to invest effort building shelters or caching food. In a fluctuating climate, the safest strategy isn't putting everything on a single square. It's spreading the risk. Anthropologists sometimes call this diversification. Don't just hunt one animal, hunt several species with different habits and habitats. Don't rely on a single plant that might fail in a drought year. Learn many, including roots and bulbs that hang on underground. Don't have only one seasonal camp. Maintain knowledge of multiple fallback sites. By the Late Pleistocene, we start to see signs of exactly this kind of strategy. In some regions, animal bones at sites show a broader spectrum of species being used. Not just the biggest, meatiest herbivores, but small game, birds, fish, shellfish where coasts and rivers were accessible. Stone tools diversify too. Tiny backed blades that might have tipped arrows for small prey, heavy points for large animals, scrapers for processing hides, specialized implements for working bone or plant fiber. This diversification isn't random, it's risk management. Another part of risk management is buffering time, finding ways to take abundance from one moment and push it forward into leaner ones. That's where storage comes in. Earlier in our story, food is mostly eaten when it's found. But as climates flicker between better and worse years, the payoff for learning to dry, smoke, freeze, or otherwise preserve food grows. In cold regions, the climate itself offers a freezer. Meat stored in permafrost cracks or cold caves could last through months of scarcity. In more temperate zones, drying strips of meat or fish in sun and smoke extends their lifespan. Seeds and nuts, if kept dry and safe from pests, can bridge the gap between seasons. Archaeologically, storage is hard to see. Containers rot. Simple caches leave little more than odd bone or seed concentrations. But there are hints. Repeated use of the same sheltered spots, pits and depressions, some researchers interpret as storage holes, patterns of animal remains that suggest slaughtering many individuals in a short window, and then somehow dealing with all that meat, viewed through the lens of climate. Storage is another way of saying, we don't trust the world to be kind next month, so we get clever. And then there's social insurance. Even with diverse diets and some storage, bad years will come. A failed migration, a late freeze, a disease in a key animal population. Any of these could wipe out a local group that tried to stand alone. One response is to not stand alone. All those networks we mentioned earlier, alliances between bands, exchange of mates, movement of materials like obsidian, shells, or special pigments over long distances could also serve as safety nets. If your hunting territory was hit hard, you might travel to kin in a better-off region. If your group had a windfall kill, inviting neighbouring bands to share, could build obligations that might be repaid when fortunes reversed. In a climate-stressed world, generosity isn't just kindness. It's investment. Some archaeologists see the spread of distinctive ornaments and symbolic objects around this time as markers of these wide social networks. A bead style that shows up at multiple sites hundreds of miles apart. A preferred pigment source carried far from its origin. Standardized forms that seem to signal shared identities. These could be the badges and tokens of alliances that make survival less tied to the fate of a single valley or herd. Overlay all of this on the geography of the time, and another key concept appears: refugia. When climates swung toward the colder, drier end, not all places suffered equally. Certain regions, coastal strips with upwelling seas, river valleys fed by glacial melt, sheltered mountain foothills, patches of forest in otherwise open land, held on to relative abundance. Plants grew there when they failed elsewhere. Animals concentrated there when surrounding habitats became harsh. Humans did the same. During the worst phases, populations seemed to have contracted into these refuges. Numbers shrank. Genetic diversity narrowed, as we talked about earlier with bottlenecks. Groups that had once been spread across broad areas found themselves packed into smaller, more ecologically favourable zones. That crowding could be deadly. Competition over limited resources, conflict between neighbouring bands. But it could also be creative. When more people share a smaller space, ideas collide more often. Innovations invented in one camp can spread quickly to others. Marriages and alliances knit communities into tighter webs. Rituals and shared stories might become more elaborate as ways of managing tension and defining group boundaries. Then, when conditions eased, when glaciers retreated a little, when rainfall patterns shifted back, when new grasslands opened up, the descendants of those concentrated populations expanded outward again. Each wave of expansion carried with it not just genes shaped by hard times, but toolkits, social practices and risk management strategies honed in the cramped crucible of refugia. In this way, climate instability doesn't simply cause cultural change. There's no simple line from temperature drops to people invent sewing needles. Instead, it sets the stage, raises the stakes, and changes which kinds of behaviours pay off. Groups that were more willing to innovate, that could maintain broad social ties, that diversified their subsistence and thought ahead, would have had an edge as the environment lurched from one state to another. Their ways of doing things, storing food, sharing with allies, experimenting with new tools, would spread. Not because the climate forced them to, but because under those conditions, those packages of behaviour worked. We can see the echoes of this in a few concrete examples. As the great ice sheets thickened over northern Europe, forests retreated and open steppe tundra expanded. Herds of reindeer and horse followed these new pastures. Human groups tracked them, learning to hunt in vast, windy spaces with few natural shelters. The elaborate mammoth bone structures of Eastern Europe may be part of this response, building reliable refuges in exposed landscapes that oscillated between bitter cold and brief, intense summers. Farther south, in what is now North Africa and the Levant, wetter green Sahara phases alternated with hyper-arid deserts. Lakes and rivers appeared, then vanished. In the wetter periods, people spread into now desert regions, leaving behind tools and art. In the dry phases, they fell back toward coasts and more reliable water sources. Each swing would have reshaped routes, resources, and who met whom. Along coasts, falling sea levels during colder periods exposed broad continental shelves. New shorelines, new estuaries, new tidal flats rich in shellfish and fish appeared. Groups tuned to these opportunities might develop boats, fishing gear, and coastal foraging expertise that would later help them move along vast stretches of shoreline as climates eased. Across all these examples, the common thread isn't a particular invention. It's a pattern of response. Under a sky that refused to settle, late Pleistocene humans became experts in not depending on any one thing. They became mobile, socially entangled, technologically experimental, and mentally attuned to change. By the time we reach that window around 50,000 years ago, the cultural accelerator may already have been primed by tens of thousands of years of living on this moving ground. The bursts of art, the refined tools, the tailored clothing, The complex shelters could be seen as one particular expression of a much older adaptation, the ability to ride out a restless planet. And that restless planet was about to open doors. Shifting climates would carve corridors out of ice and desert, link continents by temporary land bridges, and rearrange coastlines. Through those corridors and along those shores our ancestors would walk, carrying with them all the lessons the late Pleistocene had taught them about risk, cooperation, and invention. To follow them, we have to leave the refuges and step onto these new paths out of Africa, along coasts, and into lands no human had ever seen before. When people talk about the Out of Africa event, it can sound like a single dramatic moment. One day, humanity is in Africa. The next, we're striding into the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and beyond. A neat arrow on a textbook map, a turning point with a date, 60,000 years ago, give or take. Reality, again, is messier. There wasn't just one dispersal. There were waves. Earlier humans, including forms close to us but not quite modern, had already moved out of Africa long before this famous window. Fossil and stone tool evidence suggests hominins reached the Levant, and even parts of Asia, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Some of these early pioneers may have been related to our own lineage, others to Neanderthals or Denisovans, others to branches we haven't yet named. Even within our species, Homo sapiens, there are hints of earlier excursions. A jaw here, a skull fragment there, stone tools that look strikingly similar across the Red Sea basin. These suggest that people very much like you may have crossed into the Arabian Peninsula more than 100,000 years ago, during wetter phases when that region was dotted with lakes and grasslands. Most of those early movements didn't last. Climate swung back. Deserts grew. Populations that had ventured out shrank, retreated, or were absorbed into other groups. Their traces linger at a few sites, in a few bones, and perhaps in tiny scraps of DNA woven into later genomes. So when we talk about the big expansion around 60,000 years ago, we're not talking about the first time humans left Africa. We're talking about the first time a lineage left and kept going, spreading so widely and persistently that its descendants now dominate the globe. Even then, it probably wasn't a single convoy walking out in one heroic line. Think instead of repeated pulses, small bands leaving at different times, following slightly different paths, some failing, some fizzling out, some merging with others, and a few creating new footholds that would seed later expansions. What routes did they take? Here, the map blurs, and the arguments begin. One popular idea is the coastal route. Picture a world where sea levels are more than 100 meters lower than today, because so much water is locked up in ice. The shorelines, you know, are shifted far outward. Vast stretches of continental shelf are exposed, creating broad coastal plains along East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and into South Asia. Those ancient coasts would have been rich. Tidal flats, estuaries, productive shallows full of fish and shellfish, rivers meeting the sea, carrying nutrients, plant communities adapted to saline soils. For a flexible, experimenting primate that had already started to dabble in marine resources, these zones would look like a continuous band of opportunity. Archaeological sites in parts of East Africa and South Africa show people exploiting shellfish and fish tens of thousands of years before the big expansion. Stone tools and food remains in southern Arabia, and along parts of the Indian Ocean rim hint at similar behaviour later on. Some researchers imagine our ancestors surfing these coasts, moving gradually along the shoreline, never too far from familiar resources. The coastal model helps explain how humans seem to have appeared in far-flung parts of Asia relatively quickly in evolutionary terms. Move along a productive, predictable strip, and you can cover a lot of ground over generations. But the evidence is fragmentary, and there's a frustrating reason why those ancient coasts are now underwater. The very landscapes that would have hosted early camps, Shell middens and landing sites for small boats vanished beneath rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Whatever they held is now buried under meters of water and sediment. We get only occasional glimpses where erosion or chance has preserved something inland. So we turn to inland routes, the Levantine corridor up through what is now Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, the interior of Arabia, which in wetter times held lakes, rivers, and grasslands where today there is only sand. River valleys in Iran and Central Asia, corridors along the foothills of mountain ranges, stone tool traditions that can be traced from East Africa into the Levant and beyond suggest at least some groups moved this way, tracking freshwater and game rather than tides and shellfish. Animal remains at key sites point to inland hunting strategies. Ancient lake beds in Arabia have yielded stone tools that look very much like African ones. Right now, the honest statement is, both routes were probably used. At different times, under different climate regimes, different paths would open and close. When coasts were especially rich and interiors dry, shorelines would draw people. When monsoon systems shifted and inland lakes filled, those basins would become attractive. Over thousands of years, the actual story may be a braided river of paths. Inland, coastal, then inland again. Whichever specific tracks they took, one thing is clear. By around 50,000, 45,000 years ago, humans very much like you had reached far beyond Africa and the Middle East. They were in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and remarkably, in a land that did not yet exist in its modern shape, Sahul. Sahul is the name we give to the Ice Age continent formed when Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were fused into a single landmass by low sea levels. Even at glacial maximum, though, Sahul was never connected to Eurasia by dry land. To get there, you had to cross water. Not just a single little channel you could swim on a calm day, but a series of straits separating exposed islands and shelves. The exact distances and island configurations shift, depending on which sea level curve and reconstruction you use, but most models suggest that at some point any route into Sahul required open water crossings of tens of kilometres. That means boats, or rafts, or some kind of watercraft capable of carrying not just one lucky castaway, but enough people to found a viable population. Families, tools, knowledge. It also means planning. You don't wake up, see a faint line of land on the horizon, and casually decide to paddle toward it with your children and elderly relatives. You need to know how to build something that floats and doesn't immediately sink in waves. You need to predict winds and currents, at least roughly. You need to stock food and water, to choose a favourable season, to have some sense that land lies ahead. There is debate here too. Some researchers argue that even relatively simple log rafts or bundles of vegetation, combined with prevailing currents and winds, could have moved people across without highly developed navigation. Others point to the speed with which humans seem to have spread across Sahul and the diversity of its environments, tropical coasts, arid interiors, highland forests, and argue for more sophisticated seafaring and planning. The archaeological record on Sahul is still being filled in, and dates are being revised as methods improve. Some sites in northern Australia and New Guinea suggest human presence by at least 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Some researchers push that date back towards 65,000 years, while others remain cautious, waiting for more secure stratigraphy and more consistent dating. Under the surface of all these debates is a shared recognition. Reaching Sahul was not an accident. Whatever exact year you pick, sometime in this broad window, groups of Homo sapiens deliberately crossed water into a continent no human had ever seen. Once there, they spread astonishingly fast in geological terms, adapting to unfamiliar plants, animals, and climates. And here another subtle process clicks into place. Migration reshapes culture. When a small group breaks off from a larger population and moves into new territory, It carries only a slice of the genetic and cultural diversity of its parent group. This is called a founder effect. Certain lineages, certain customs, certain ways of solving problems become overrepresented simply because the people who happen to leave had them. Then the new land starts to push back. Different animals to hunt, different plants to learn, different seasons to track. Fire behaves differently in eucalyptus woodland than in African savanna. Rainfall patterns in a monsoon climate don't match those of a Mediterranean one. Predators, parasites, soils, even the shape of the coastline create new challenges and opportunities. Under these conditions, culture can change quickly. Hunting strategies shift to match new prey. Tool types are abandoned, modified, or invented to deal with different materials. Myths and stories adjust to new landscapes, new dangers, new sacred places. Over a surprisingly short number of generations, a group's daily life and mental world can become distinct from that of its cousins back home. We see hints of this in the archaeological record as human groups spread eastward. Tool traditions diverge. Rock art styles in different parts of Sahul show local flavours. Burn patterns and charcoal in sediments suggest deliberate use of fire to manage landscapes in ways that differ from African precedents. But there are gaps in this record, huge ones. Sites are unevenly preserved. Tropical climates destroy organic remains. Rising seas have erased many of the best early coastal camps. Dating techniques, while vastly improved, still come with error ranges and assumptions that researchers argue about in painstaking detail. New discoveries can shift timelines by thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. A single well-dated site in one cave can rewrite textbooks for an entire region. So when we tell this story, we have to hold two truths at once. On one hand, there is a broad, robust picture. By around 50,000 years ago, humans forged in African bottlenecks and late Pleistocene instability were moving out along multiple routes, exploiting coasts and interiors, and accomplishing feats of migration that required planning, cooperation, and flexible technology. They reached Sahul and rapidly diversified their ways of living there. On the other hand, the details, the exact paths, precise dates, particular boat designs and step-by-step cultural changes are still shadowy. Our reconstructions are careful guesses built from scattered bones, stone chips, and chemical traces in sediments. What we can say without overreaching is that expansion and culture co-evolved. The same networks and technologies we've already talked about, language, shared tool traditions, wide alliances, diversified subsistence, helped people move into new lands. And in turn, those new lands reshaped those very networks and technologies, spinning off new languages, new tools, new rituals. There is no single cause here, no one invention that made global migration possible. Instead, there is a package: social brains, flexible speech, clever hands, risk-spreading strategies, and a willingness to push into the unknown. As these small bands walked and sailed away from their ancestral refuges, they didn't know they were crossing a threshold. They were just following rivers, shorelines, and stories about distant places. But with each step along those coasts, each crossing between islands, each camp pitched in a place no human had ever slept before, they were quietly redrawing the map of the possible. Beyond Sahul, more lands and more encounters waited. Along the great arcs of Eurasia, other humans were already there. Neanderthals in the west, Denisovans and their kin in the east, shaped by their own long histories. When our expanding lineage met them, the story of human diversity would take another unexpected turn. By the time your lineage had threaded its way along those coasts and corridors, the world was not empty. It was already inhabited by other kinds of humans, each with their own long, quiet history. To the west and north, across the Levant and deep into Europe, lived the Neanderthals. They'd been there a long time by the time your ancestors arrived in force, hundreds of thousands of years adapting to cold winters, patchy resources, and big dangerous animals. Their world stretched from the Atlantic fringes of Iberia through Central Europe into Western Asia, dipping south into parts of the Levant whenever the climate allowed. Farther east there were Denisovans and probably other still unnamed lineages. The genetic signals that we collectively call Denisovan today come from a few fragments in a Siberian cave, but the DNA trail they left winds across much of Asia. Their descendants' genetic fingerprints show up in people from the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Australia, and the Tibetan Plateau. They almost certainly weren't confined to one valley or one cave. They occupied a continent's worth of niches. And in Africa, throughout all of this, there were still multiple diverse populations of Homo sapiens themselves. Regional groups with deep roots and local histories, not a single homogeneous block waiting to march out. So when the later waves of Homo sapiens moved into Eurasia around, and after 60,000 years ago, they were not pioneers into untouched wilderness. They were latecomers arriving in neighbourhoods that already had residents. What happened when those worlds touched? Here, bones and tools go strangely quiet, but DNA starts to speak. If our lineage and Neanderthals had simply glared at each other across river valleys for tens of thousands of years, never mixing, you'd expect that to show up in genetics. Clear, clean separation. Two lines diverged. That's not what we find. If you carry ancestry from outside Africa, somewhere between about 1 and 2% of your DNA today is Neanderthal in origin. It doesn't come in one solid chunk. It's scattered in little segments across the genome, like faint echoes of very old encounters. People in parts of Melanesia and Australia carry additional components, up to several percent, from Denisovans or Denisovan-like groups. Again, not in a single block, but in many small fragments. The pattern of these fragments, and how they're chopped up and diluted, tells us those encounters weren't a one-night stand for the species. There were multiple episodes of interbreeding in different places at different times. Modern human groups meet Neanderthals in one region and mix a little. Farther east, other groups meet Denisovans and do the same. Some of those mixed populations move on, carrying this blended heritage into new lands. From a genetic point of view, that implies more than just violence or avoidance. It implies enough sustained contact, shared camps, overlapping territories, long-term proximity, for relationships to form and children to be born and raised. What did those meetings look like on the ground? We don't know. We can't. We can imagine a spectrum. At one end there is conflict. Competition over hunting grounds, watering holes, caves used as seasonal refuges. Neanderthals were powerful hunters with intimate knowledge of their landscapes. Our own ancestors brought flexible tactics, new weapons, and wider social networks. Where ranges overlapped, tensions were probably real. At the other end of the spectrum there is exchange. Not necessarily formal trade caravans, but informal borrowing. Watching how the locals nap a certain kind of stone, or where they find particular pigments, or how they ambush a wary species of deer. Maybe gestures and grunted words at first, then more structured communication as shared vocabularies and mixed children knit groups together. In between lies a messy mix of imitation, parallel invention, and shared learning. When we see similar tools and ornaments in Neanderthal and Homo sapiens layers that are close in time and space, there are at least 3 possibilities. 1. Your ancestors arrived, and local Neanderthals copied their bone points, beads, or blade technologies. 2. Neanderthals had already been experimenting with similar ideas, and Homo sapiens adopted or refined them. 3. Both groups, facing similar environments and raw materials, independently converged on similar solutions. The current evidence doesn't let us choose a single story. At some sites in Europe and the Near East, Neanderthal occupations show new tool types and ornaments right around the time modern humans appear nearby, That could be cultural influence, it could be shared traditions in a contact zone, or it could be the archaeological illusion of separate cultures neatly tied to one species when the reality was blended. The safer conclusion is that ideas, like genes, could move between groups. Interbreeding shows the physical side of that. Cultural overlap, similar hafting techniques, pigments, possible personal ornaments, suggests a mental side too. The humans of this world weren't living in sealed species bubbles. They were neighbours, rivals, sometimes mates, sometimes students of each other's tricks. And yet, one big fact looms in the background. Today, only one of those lineages is left as a distinct, self-reproducing group. Neanderthals vanish from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years depending on region. Denisovans disappear even more hazily, their presence lingering more in genomes than in bones. Why? There is a temptation to reach for a simple answer. We were smarter, or more advanced, or destined to replace them. Science pushes back hard against that kind of story. Neanderthals had large brains, complex tools, controlled fire, hunted cooperatively, and seemed to have cared for injured and sick group members. They buried their dead. They likely had some form of language. Denisovans, to judge from their adaptive genes, mastered everything from tropical islands to high-altitude plateaus. The more honest picture is multi-causal. Climate flickered sharply during the period when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals overlapped in Europe. Rapid swings between cold and slightly warmer phases scrambled ecosystems. Large mammals that both groups depended on shifted their ranges, declined or vanished. Populations that were already relatively small and fragmented, like Neanderthals, would have been especially vulnerable to these swings. Into that unstable world came a new competitor. Homo sapiens groups seem to have had larger and more flexible social networks, connecting distant bands through kinship and exchange. That kind of web is a powerful buffer. If game fails in one valley, you have relatives 2 valleys away. If a hunting technique works in one region, stories can spread it far and fast. We may also have carried different disease packages. When previously separated populations meet, microbes move with them. Germs that are mild in one group thanks to long-term exposure can be devastating to another. There's growing speculation that part of Neanderthals' decline might have involved pathogens introduced by Homo sapiens, just as later in history, diseases carried by Eurasians devastated Native American populations. The evidence here is still sketchy, but the general principle is well documented in other contexts. On top of this, there is simple arithmetic. If a small population and a larger one interbreed even modestly over time, the genes of the smaller group can be absorbed into the larger without leaving a separate, recognizable population behind. That seems to be part of what happened. Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't vanish without a trace. Pieces of them are literally inside you, stitched into the chromosomes of living people. Some of those pieces mattered. Neanderthal-derived genes in modern Eurasians, and their descendants are involved in skin and hair biology, immune responses, even how we react to certain pathogens. Denisovan-derived variants in Tibetan populations help with oxygen processing at high altitudes. Other archaic DNA segments seem to influence how we process fats or respond to ultraviolet light or react to viruses. When your ancestors moved into new climates, they didn't just rely on their own recent African toolkit. They also picked up useful genetic solutions from the humans who were already there, a kind of biological borrowing layered over cultural borrowing. So these encounters weren't just episodes of conflict or replacement, they were also moments of fusion and adaptation. The long-term result is that modern humans are not a pure, isolated line. We are hybrids in subtle ways, carrying traces of multiple branches of that old human tree. This complicates any story about superiority. Homo sapiens did end up as the only surviving human species, but survival doesn't equal moral worth or inherent betterness. It may reflect accident, timing, demographic momentum, and the particular combination of social structures, technologies, and environments that happen to favor our branch. What it definitely reflects is mixture. When you picture that world around 50,000 years ago, coasts and inland routes, small boats nosing toward unknown shores, camps lit by fire under unfamiliar stars, you can also picture overlapping circles of humans whose faces might not have looked exactly like yours, but who were close enough to love, to fight, to learn from. They changed us as much as we changed them, and as our lineage moved deeper into their lands, carrying borrowed genes and borrowed ideas, another transformation was quietly gaining speed. The rise of external memory, the symbols, marks, and shared traditions that would let human groups carry knowledge beyond any single brain or lifetime. When we talk about memory, it's easy to imagine it as something sealed inside a skull. Neurons firing, connections strengthening or fading. But around the time your ancestors were walking into Neanderthal valleys and Denisovan mountains, something else was starting to crystallize, memory that lived outside of brains. Think about a simple notch on a piece of bone. To us, it looks like a scratch. To the person who made it, it might have been a tally of kills, days, shellfish gathering trips, or the phases of the moon. The point isn't what it recorded. The point is that it recorded anything at all. Once a mark stands for something beyond itself, you've created a tiny external memory device. The information is no longer trapped in the one mind that remembers it. It sits there, waiting for other minds to read it, today or next year. We start seeing this kind of thing in the archaeological record tens of thousands of years ago. Engraved ochre chunks in southern Africa with repeating patterns, notched bones in Europe that might be counts or calendars, shells and teeth arranged in ways that seem to follow rules, not just random decoration. Are these writing? No. That would be an overstatement. But they are durable signals, a necklace pattern that always means adult woman of this clan, a certain pigment combination that marks a coming-of-age ritual, a carved design that everyone in the group knows belongs to the spirits of a particular place. Once that connection is shared, the object itself becomes a memory aid, a stabilizer of meaning. Stories work the same way, but through sound instead of stone. A hunting technique is one thing. A hunting story is something else. The story packages the technique in a memorable sequence. Characters, dangers, a turning point, a moral. It sticks in children's heads. They repeat it, distort it, improve it, and pass it on. No story fossilizes. But the moment you have communities spread out across landscapes, facing seasonal uncertainty, with knowledge that can mean the difference between life and death, the pressure for reliable storytelling ramps up. A good story is a way of keeping the past alive in the present, a way of making memory contagious. Now add something even more powerful, teaching on purpose. Plenty of animals learn from each other. Young chimps watch older chimps crack nuts. Juvenile wolves follow the pack on hunts. But most of that learning is observational and opportunistic. What seems to shift in our lineage, especially by the time of this late Pleistocene cultural acceleration, is the emergence of sustained structured teaching. Imagine a teenager learning to make a complex composite spear, selecting the right stone, shaping it with prepared core techniques, smoothing a shaft, making glue from heated resins, binding everything with animal sinew. One mistake and the whole thing fails. You don't want each generation reinventing that from scratch. So you get something like apprenticeship. Older individuals slowing down their own work to guide clumsy hands, repeating steps, correcting mistakes, demonstrating again. Maybe using special words for particular moves or materials. Over and over, until the skill is not just done, but understood. We can't see the words, but we can see the outcome. Long sequences of actions become standardized across wide areas and long stretches of time. That kind of stability doesn't happen if everyone is just guessing. Ritual adds yet another layer. Take a dance, a chant, a sequence of movements around a fire that has to be done just so. On the surface, it might look like pure symbolism, nothing practical at all. But rituals are repeated. They're emotionally charged. They pull many people into the same pattern at once. That makes them excellent carriers of information. Embedded in a ritual might be rules about who can marry whom, where you can hunt and where you must not, the proper way to treat a corpse, the sequence for harvesting and storing a seasonal food. The participants may not think of it as information management, but that's part of what it is. You don't have to remember a list of rules, you just have to remember the ritual, and the ritual will bring the rules along with it. Over generations, this mixture of external memory, objects, marks, stories, formal teaching, repeated rituals feed something else, cumulative culture. Without cumulative culture, clever ideas appear and vanish, with the people who came up with them. A slightly better spear point, an efficient snare, a new medicinal plant use. If no one reliably learns it and passes it on intact, the improvement dies with its inventor. With cumulative culture, small tweaks stick. A more efficient binding method becomes the new normal. Someone adds barbs to a point. The next person refines the angle. A third figures out a better sharpening technique. Over centuries, you don't just have a spear, you have a lineage of spears, each one inheriting improvements from the last. The archaeological signature of this is subtle but real. Sequences where tool types don't just appear and disappear, but show patterned elaboration, regional styles that persist and diverge, ornaments that become more standardized within an area and more distinct between areas. Here we have to be careful. Artifacts are physical. We can date them, measure them, compare them. Social institutions like apprenticeship, priesthood, or teaching elders are inferences. They're models we build to explain patterns in the objects. When we see standardized tools across a region, one interpretation is that formal teaching and strong traditions held those designs in place. When we see long sequences of increasingly complex ornaments, one interpretation is that people cared about continuity and style, not just function. Could there be other explanations? Yes. Independent invention, environmental constraints, the properties of particular raw materials. Archaeologists argue about the balance all the time. But taken together with the global spread of similar symbol systems, the repeated use of pigments, the consistency of certain burial practices, the apparent long-term stability of regional toolkits, many researchers see the outlines of societies that were investing heavily in external memory. A world where knowledge wasn't just in brains, but also in shared stories, marks, and rituals that made that knowledge resilient. From the ground, if you were living then, it might not have felt like a revolution. Your grandmother taught you to nap the way her grandmother had. The initiation chant felt ancient, even if it was only a few generations old. The marks on the cave wall had always been there, even if they were recent. But from a distance, from our vantage point, looking back across tens of thousands of years, this slow accumulation of external memory looks like a turning point. It's what allowed culture to start behaving a little bit like a second genome. Information stored outside bodies, copied with variation and selection, building layer upon layer. And once that process really got going, it set the stage for everything that came after. New brains growing up inside dense webs of tradition, genes and culture, intertwining in ways that would reshape what it meant to be human. By now you might be wondering, if culture was doing all this heavy lifting, did our biology really change at all around this time? Or are we basically the same creatures, just wearing different hats and telling more complicated stories? This is where things get slippery. Linking genes to something as intricate as symbolic thought or complex language is extremely hard. A gene is a stretch of DNA that helps build proteins, regulate development, tweak brain chemistry. It's not a creativity gene or a storytelling gene. Those labels are metaphors. Behavior, especially human behavior, is the outcome of thousands of genes interacting with each other, plus early development, plus nutrition, plus social environment, plus sheer chance. When we see a behavioral shift in the archaeological record and then go hunting through the genome for a smoking gun, we're often asking biology for a level of precision it can't give us. So the honest answer is, we don't know exactly what, if anything, changed genetically around 50,000 years ago that could explain the cultural takeoff. But we can talk about some plausible kinds of changes. One big idea isn't about new abilities, but about timing. Our species is unusual in how long our children stay dependent. Human childhood and adolescence stretch on for years. That long, slow developmental runway gives the brain a huge window for learning. If anything in our biology shifted, it may have been subtle changes in this timing. Slightly longer periods of brain plasticity. A slower closing of windows for language learning. A tweak in how teenage brains respond to elders and peers. These wouldn't show up in fossils. They wouldn't produce a new skull shape we could point to and say, aha, revolution. But they could change how much culture could be packed into a single lifetime. Another possible lever is learning capacity itself. Brains don't just get smarter in a simple way. They can become more efficient at forming long chains of actions, better at tracking who knows what in a group, more sensitive to patterns in sounds or marks. Imagine small genetic differences that make it slightly easier for children to imitate complex sequences, or to remember arbitrary associations between a symbol and its meaning. Those differences wouldn't automatically produce art or mathematics. What they would do is make a culture that already has teaching, ritual, and external symbols a bit more stable and a bit more ambitious. Tiny advantages in learning can compound over generations when culture is cumulative. Plasticity is part of the same story. Plasticity just means the ability of a brain to be shaped by experience. A highly plastic brain is like wet clay that takes an impression easily. A less plastic brain is more like fired ceramic. If late Pleistocene humans had slightly more plastic brains, especially in areas linked to language and social cognition, that might have allowed them to absorb and refine increasingly complex cultural systems without changing their basic genetic blueprint very much. But all of this is inference. It's what would make sense given what we know from developmental psychology and comparative biology. We can't yet point to specific mutations with precise dates and say, this one extended childhood by 2 years in this region at this time, and then there's FOXP2. You may have heard this gene described as the language gene. That's catchy but misleading. FOXP2 is a regulatory gene that affects how other genes are expressed, especially in brain regions involved in motor control and sequencing. In modern humans, rare damaging mutations in FOXP2 can cause serious problems with speech articulation and grammar. That tells us it's important for the smooth coordination of the movements and patterns that speech requires. When researchers compared FOXP2 in humans and other primates, they found that our version has a couple of amino acid changes not seen in chimpanzees. At first, some scientists thought maybe those changes were recent, perhaps the magical switch that turned on complex language. But later work complicated the picture. The Neanderthals and Denisovans we've sequenced so far seem to share the same FOX2 amino acid changes that modern humans have. That pushes the key modifications back well before 50,000 years ago, probably hundreds of thousands of years earlier. So what is FOXP2 not? It's not a lone special gene that suddenly appeared and gave us language overnight. It doesn't work like installing a language app in a brain that was previously mute, and because multiple human species carried the same derived version, FOXP2, can't by itself explain why our lineage produced global symbolic cultures and Neanderthals eventually disappeared. What FOXP2 does show is that some of the biological groundwork for sophisticated vocal learning and sequencing was laid deep in our ancestry, long before the cultural explosion. The hardware for complex speech-like behavior was probably in place. How that hardware was used and how far it was pushed by culture is another question. This brings us to a deeper possibility. Maybe the biggest changes were not dramatic new biological capacities, but subtle cognitive shifts riding on top of an already capable brain. A small change in working memory, how many items you can juggle at once in your mind, might make complex sentences easier or allow more steps in a tool-making sequence. A shift in social cognition might make it more natural to infer what others believe, to track reputations, to coordinate in larger groups. Tiny biases toward pattern-seeking might make symbols more alluring. Individually, these tweaks could be almost invisible. Together, in the context of growing external memory and dense traditions, they could nudge societies toward more elaborate myths, more complex rituals, more intricate technologies. Or, as many researchers argue, perhaps the main engine really was cultural. On this view, by 50,000 years ago, the human brain was already broadly modern. The reason we suddenly see more art, more ornaments, more specialized tools isn't because brains changed dramatically, but because culture hit a tipping point. Population densities rose, networks thickened, external memory scaffolds expanded, and ideas could finally accumulate without constantly being lost. Biology didn't step aside in this story, it interacted with culture. That interaction, gene-culture feedback, is crucial. Once you have even modest levels of cumulative culture, culture itself becomes part of the environment that natural selection acts on. If your group has efficient teaching, children who are better at paying attention to teachers will do better. If your society relies heavily on oral tradition, individuals with slightly better verbal memory will have an edge. If your survival depends on navigating complex kinship rules, minds that find those patterns intuitive will leave more descendants. Over thousands of years, those tiny advantages can shift gene frequencies. Genes that make you a bit better at living in a symbol-saturated, tradition-bound world become more common. In turn, that makes it easier for culture to get even more elaborate, which then changes the selection pressures again. We end up with a loop: culture shaping genes, genes shaping the capacity for culture, on and on. Not in a single revolution, but in a long, tangled coevolution. Where does that leave us? Somewhere in between certainty and mystery. We can say that by 50,000 years ago, our ancestors had brains and bodies capable of everything we see in the archaeological record and more. We can say that specific genes, like FOXP2, played roles in building those brains, but not that any one gene explains the cultural surge. We can say that subtle differences in development, plasticity and learning probably mattered, but not exactly how or when they arose. Beyond that, we're in the realm of careful speculation. What we can do is compare models of what changed. Was it mainly culture, mainly biology, or an intricate mix, and ask how well each model fits the evidence we have. That's where we're heading next. So, standing here at the edge of all this evidence and uncertainty, we can finally ask the question that's been quietly humming underneath the whole episode. What actually changed around 50,000 years ago? Archaeologists, geneticists, and anthropologists don't all agree. But you can roughly group their ideas into a few big models. Think of them as different lenses you can look through. Each one brings some parts of the picture into sharp focus and leaves other parts a bit blurry. The first lens is the sudden revolution model. On this view, there really was a turning point. Something shifted in the human mind, maybe a genetic tweak, maybe a new way of wiring up existing brain circuits, and suddenly symbolic thought, complex language, and rapid innovation became possible in a way they hadn't been before. If you like clean stories, this model is tempting. It neatly explains why, in some regions, the archaeological record seems to go from relatively simple toolkits and sparse symbolism to dense clusters of art, ornaments, long-distance trade, and elaborate technologies in a comparatively short window. It fits well with spectacular finds, the painted caves in Europe, the sudden appearance of figurative carvings, the burst of regional styles in tools and ornaments. It matches that intuitive feeling of before this, nothing, after this, everything. But it struggles in a few important ways. The timing doesn't line up perfectly across the globe. In southern Africa, there are shell beads and engraved ochre pieces that may be 70,000 or even 100,000 years old. In parts of Asia, complex tools and symbolic artifacts appear on their own schedules, not neatly snapped to a single global date. If a single genetic mutation had switched on modern cognition around 50,000 years ago, you'd expect a sharper and more synchronized break. Instead, what we see looks messier, more staggered, more like waves overlapping than a single explosion. That leads to the second lens, the gradual mosaic model. Here there is no magic threshold. Instead, different elements of what we call modern behavior emerge in different places at different times. Symbolic marks in one region, complex hunting strategies in another, standardized tools somewhere else. Over tens of thousands of years, these pieces slowly assemble into the full package we recognize as us. This model explains the long prehistory of symbolic artifacts before 50,000 years ago. It handles regional quirks well. Some areas show early art but conservative toolkits. Others show advanced hunting technology before they show much ornamentation. It fits the idea that Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early Homo sapiens all had overlapping, but not identical, cognitive and cultural capacities. Where it struggles is with the apparent steepness of the curve. If everything is gradual and patchy, why does the record in some places suddenly feel like a spike? Why, once those mosaics get dense enough, does change start to look so fast? That question brings us to the third lens, the demographic threshold model. This one says, don't look first at brains, look at bodies. Look at how many people there are, and how connected they are. On this view, the mental hardware for complex culture was mostly in place well before 50,000 years ago. What changed was population structure. Numbers went up, networks thickened, groups overlapped more, information flow sped up. In small, isolated bands, brilliant ideas die all the time. If the person who knows how to make the best spear points gets sick, or the only storyteller who remembers a crucial ritual drowns in a flood, the knowledge can vanish in a single unlucky week. But once there are enough people and enough links between groups, culture becomes harder to kill. Skills can be copied and recopied. Rituals can spread and be reinforced. Innovations in one valley can travel 3 valleys over before a drought wipes the first group out. Mathematically, systems like this often produce curves that look like takeoffs. For a long time, improvements are slow and fragile. Then, once a certain density is reached, new ideas start to stack on top of old ones instead of constantly falling back to zero. The line bends upward and suddenly it looks like everything changed at once. This model does a good job explaining why we see more art, more specialized tools, more regional styles, and longer distance trade around the time human population size and connectivity are thought to be rising. It's also compatible with gene-culture coevolution. Growing cultural complexity feeds back into biology over time. But it can underplay something important. Even if you have lots of people and thick networks, that doesn't automatically produce sophisticated symbolism or elaborate ritual. You still need minds that find those things compelling, that are ready to live in a world saturated with stories and norms. The fourth lens pushes even harder in a different direction. It says, be careful. maybe a big part of what looks like a revolution is actually just preservation bias. The archaeological record is not a neutral mirror of the past. It's a patchwork of accidents. Some environments preserve bones and pigments beautifully, others dissolve them. Sea levels rise and drown entire coastal worlds. Cave art happens to survive better than open-air paintings. Beads carved from ivory or shell might last. Body paint and tattoos almost never will. If more of the older record has simply been erased, and more of the last 50,000 years has survived, then our sense of a sudden flowering might be at least partly an illusion of visibility. This model explains why some regions seem to wake up late. Maybe they were always busy, but their early traces are gone. It reminds us not to confuse absence of evidence with evidence of absence. Of course, taken alone, preservation bias can't explain clear pattern shifts, like the sudden clustering of caves with dense imagery in certain periods, or the real expansion of humans into new and harsh environments. Something did change, so we're left with 4 imperfect lenses. A cognitive or genetic revolution that explains sharp local transitions, but ignores early mosaics. A long, gradual build-up that fits the scattered evidence but has trouble with steep curves. A demographic threshold that captures the power of population and networks but risks treating minds as static. A preservation bias caution that reminds us our windows into the past are cracked, fogged, and uneven. The reality is probably a weave of all these threads. Brains that were already powerful, nudged by small biological tweaks. Cultures slowly assembling mosaics of techniques, rituals, and symbols over tens of thousands of years. Populations crossing thresholds where ideas could finally accumulate instead of evaporate. And a fossil record that shows us more of some times and places than others, making gentle slopes look like cliffs. Region by region, the timing tells this tangled story. In southern Africa, engraved ochre, shell beads, and complex hunting strategies appear tens of thousands of years before the classic European cave paintings. In Europe, those caves flare to life around 40,000 years ago, just as modern humans arrive and mix with Neanderthals. In island Southeast Asia and Australia, people are crossing open water and adapting to strange new ecosystems earlier than you might expect if you only looked at Europe. There is no single global on switch. There are multiple local takeoffs, each riding its own combination of climate, population, contact with other humans, and the fragile survival of artifacts. What changed then is less like a lightning bolt and more like a slow, spreading glow. By around 50,000 years ago, enough pieces had come together in enough places that human life crossed a kind of practical boundary. Our ancestors were no longer just clever animals reacting to their surroundings. They were living inside thick worlds of shared meaning, inherited stories, binding obligations, invisible rules. Those worlds haven't gone away. They've only grown denser. The same forces that once turned scattered bands into symbol-making cultures still shape the way we live now. Crowded networks, fragile memories, stories that refuse to die, and brains tuned to navigate a maze of meanings. In the last part of this journey, we'll step back from the caves and coastlines and ask what that ancient shift left inside us. How a quiet, gradual inflection in the deep past still echoes in the way you think, worry, cooperate, and dream tonight as you fall asleep. The echo of that inflection point is still with you. When you scroll through messages, listen to a podcast, or drift off to sleep with a story playing in the background, you're living inside a world that only exists because, somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, a few quiet thresholds were crossed. The evidence points in that direction, even if it doesn't draw a perfectly sharp line. We see art and ornaments appearing in scattered places earlier than 50,000 years ago. Simple beads, engraved pieces of ochre, pigments collected and carried for no purely practical reason. We see toolkits that become a little more specialized, then more standardized, then clearly embedded in traditions that stretch beyond one valley or one lifetime. We see signs that language was already sophisticated enough to support long-distance trade, teaching and ritual. Not because we can hear those voices, but because the things they coordinated and remembered would be impossible without it. We see population curves bending upward, networks thickening, interbreeding between different human groups, leaving faint signatures in your genes and mine. We see the traces of people living in cold, dry, marginal lands that would have been out of reach without better clothing, better shelters, better cooperation. None of this proves a single Big Bang moment at 50,000 years ago. It does suggest that by that time enough pieces were in place that culture could begin to do something new, build on itself instead of constantly crumbling and starting over. Tiny improvements in communication meant a hunting trick could spread faster than it disappeared. Slightly denser networks meant one group's innovation could be copied, altered and improved by neighbours they would never even meet. A little more symbolic thinking meant that stone and bone were no longer just tools, but carriers of meaning, of clan identity, reputation, obligation, and memory. Those are small thresholds. They don't feel dramatic if you imagine living through them. One generation's speech might sound almost identical to the next. A new style of blade might look like a modest tweak on the old one. A new story told around the fire might seem like just another way of explaining why the seasons change. But when you stack those small differences over thousands of years, they redirect history. This is one of the core ideas hiding underneath the dates and debates. You don't always need a new kind of brain to change the trajectory of a species. Sometimes you just need minds that are already powerful, placed in slightly different social and environmental conditions. More people, more contact, more chances for ideas to bump into each other, merge and survive. From a distance, the record looks like it speeds up around 50,000 years ago because that's roughly when these thresholds were crossed in enough places, with enough density, that the slope of the curve changed, not from nothing to everything, but from fragile, scattered sparks to a fire that could keep spreading. The mystery is that we can't see it cleanly. The ground has shifted. Coastlines have drowned. Caves have collapsed. Entire chapters are missing. What we have instead are glimpses, a handprint on a wall, a handful of beads, a scatter of bones with cut marks, a piece of ochre with lines scratched into it, for reasons we can only guess at. From those fragments we infer that something about human life became different in kind, not just in degree. People began living inside thick layers of shared meaning, kinship rules, myths, taboos, reputations that could outlast any single person. They didn't just survive winters and droughts. They survived in stories. You are still inside that world. Every law, every calendar, every belief about what's fair or unfair, sacred or trivial, possible or impossible, is built on top of that same invisible infrastructure. Language that can refer to things that don't exist yet, memories that can be passed down far beyond one lifespan, networks that can carry information faster than any one traveller could walk. You inherited a brain shaped by those long bottlenecks and expansions. A brain tuned to look for patterns in noise, to care about what other people think, to hold on to rituals and narratives even when the practical reason for them has faded. You inherited through culture the descendants of those first symbolic marks, alphabets, numbers, musical notation, diagrams, code. You live in a city of layered meanings that began, very quietly, when a few scattered bands found ways to keep their stories from dying when their storytellers did. If you want a picture to fall asleep with, you can set aside the charts and dates and imagine this instead. A circle of people in the dark, 60,000 or 40,000 or 20,000 years ago. The exact date doesn't matter. Outside the circle, it's cold. An animal has been hunted, butchered, cooked. Smoke drifts upward and disappears into a sky full of unfamiliar constellations. Someone is speaking. Maybe they're explaining how to nap a stone in just the right way, or how to watch the wind when you follow a herd. Maybe they're telling a story about a time when the world almost ended, and how a small band of ancestors survived by listening to the animals or the spirits or each other. A child is listening. Half of what they hear is practical knowledge. The other half is pattern. Who gets to speak? When people laugh? Which parts of the story everyone already knows and nods along to? That child's brain is linking words to emotions, rules to faces, myths to movements of stars and seasons. Years later they will tell their own version of the story. Some details will shift, others will be repeated so faithfully it hurts. Slowly, across generations, that shared world of meaning thickens. New tools appear, new rituals form, new marks are scratched into bone and stone. The firelight changes faces, but the pattern stays. When you listen to a whispered podcast in the dark, or watch a screen flicker as you drift towards sleep, you are sitting in that same circle by another name. The fuel is different, but the glow is the same. So as you lie there, somewhere in the long chain of descendants, you can let the questions about exact dates and models loosen a bit. The truth is that we don't know precisely why the line steepened when it did. We see hints of cognitive shifts, demographic thresholds, preservation quirks, and long, slow mosaics. We see enough to sketch possibilities, not enough to draw a map. What we do know is that by around 50,000 years ago, culture itself had become a force as powerful as climate or predators. It could carry knowledge beyond memory, bind strangers together, and remake landscapes. That force has only grown. You're inside it now, listening to a voice built out of language that has been refining itself for tens of thousands of years, carried to you by technologies that are, at their core, just very elaborate ways of moving symbols around. If you found this journey soothing, or it sparked a thought somewhere between waking and sleep, you can help keep the chain going. Gently tap like or leave a comment, or subscribe if you'd like more slow walks through deep time. If you're still awake, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. One more small data point in a vast, tangled human network. For now, you can let the deep past fade to the edges of your mind. The bottlenecks, the migrations, the first beads and stories, they're still with you whether you think about them or not. The fire has been burning a very long time. You're just resting for a moment beside it, on your way through the dark.